What if the two fiercest competitors in the AI wars are actually mathematically destined to become the exact same model?
It sounds crazy, right?
It really does. I mean, you look at the headlines today, you see the massive venture capital funding rounds, the huge marketing campaigns, and you'd think you're witnessing this epic battle of independent
Oh,
visionaries.
yeah, totally. The narrative is always about nimble, ethics-focused startups out-innovating legacy tech giants with just, pure code.
Right. But today, we are stripping all of that away. We're tearing down the public relations illusion to look at the brutal trillion-dollar physical cartel running behind the scenes. We're taking a deep dive into a stack of architectural white papers and economic analyses that completely reframe the relationship between Anthropic and Google.
Exactly. And just to be clear, we are skipping all the standard boring promotional specs about server hardware
And
today.
absolutely, no spec sheets here.
We don't care about the official press releases or the scale metrics they brag about. We are focusing 100% of our weight on the physical, architectural, and economic power dynamic, specifically between Anthropic and Google.
Because when you look past the whole techs are good narrative, you reveal an industry that is entirely dictated by the unyielding laws of physics, data flow, and hardware monopolies. So, for everyone listening, the mission today is to show you how the software you think is so revolutionary is actually entirely subordinate to the physical infrastructure it runs on.
Yeah, the overarching narrative we are constantly fed is that artificial intelligence is this, ethereal software layer.
Like it's just pure thought.
Right. Pure thought floating in the cloud, completely detached from physical constraints. But the reality, as we dig into the actual computer architecture and the capital mechanisms, is that the software is trapped.
It's completely bound by the silicon.
Precisely. And understanding that requires us to completely abandon the idea of architectural independence. I mean, AI companies routinely build their whole brand identities around their proprietary architectures.
Sure, they publish all these papers on their unique routing algorithms or their specialized attention mechanisms.
But those software architectures do not exist in a vacuum. They are physically bound by the specific silicon they run on.
So let's apply this directly to Anthropic and their flagship model, Claude, which, runs on Google's infrastructure, specifically Google's TPUs or tensor processing units.
Right.
If we accept that Anthropic has some of the absolute brightest minds in machine learning writing their code, we have to ask why that code is ultimately subservient to the hardware.
And that boils down to the fundamental difference between a traditional general-purpose GPU and Google's TPU. That is the root of this entire bottleneck.
Walk us through that, because a GPU, with its history and graphics rendering, is built for asynchronous flexibility, right?
Yeah, exactly. A GPU handles warp scheduling, highly fragmented memory logic, and all these divergent branching execution paths.
Because rendering a chaotic video game scene requires that kind of adaptability. You don't know what the player's going to do next.
Right, so the GPU architecture allows developers to throw incredibly messy, branching math at the processor, and the processor will efficiently sort it out. But Google deliberately did not build a GPU.
They build an ASIC.
Yes, the TPU is an application-specific integrated circuit. It's an ASIC that is hyper-specialized for one singular mathematical operation, which is matrix multiplication.
So it's not flexible at all.
Not even a little bit. The physical layout of a TPU relies on what we call a systolic array.
A systolic array, that's a completely different physical paradigm from a GPU, right?
It's totally different.
Yeah.
Instead of independent cores grabbing data asynchronously, a systolic array is this rigid spatial architecture. Think of it like a massive, synchronized factory assembly line.
Okay.
The data flows through a grid of arithmetic logic units and a continuous, unyielding pulse,
Yeah.
like a heartbeat. It achieves terrifying computational efficiency, but at the cost of absolute rigidity. The physical layout demands that the data conforms to its specific structural appetite.
So if Anthropic's engineers design a highly creative, non-standard AI architecture, say, some novel approach to sparse activation that requires intense, unpredictable branching logic, they hit a physical wall.
A massive physical wall.
They can't just force asynchronous, chaotic logic through a synchronous systolic array.
Exactly. If they attempt to push that non-standard logic into the TPU, it actually disrupts the synchronized pulse of the array. The data flow stalls out, creating what computer architects call a bubble in the pipeline.
A bubble.
Yeah, and when that happens, the surrounding processors are suddenly starved of data. They're just sitting idle, burning immense amounts of power while performing literally zero calculations.
And when you are renting tens of thousands of these chips, liquid cooling them, and paying exorbitant compute costs, a pipeline bubble isn't just some minor inefficiency.
Oh no, it is a catastrophic financial hemorrhage. The financial pressure dictates that Anthropic simply cannot afford to innovate in ways that cause bubbles.
So the physical architecture of the TPU actually dictates the software architecture of the AI.
100%. Anthropic has no choice but to compromise Claude's internal mathematical structures to perfectly fit the rigid physical requirements of Google's systolic arrays.
Their algorithms have to be smoothed out.
Smoothed out, regularized, and molded to feed the TPU efficiently.
Our sources use a phenomenal analogy here that I want to bring up, the smartphone camera market.
Oh, that's a great one.
Right, because every year you see manufacturers like Apple, Xiaomi, or Vivo get on stage and heavily market their unique color science.
Yeah, their proprietary portrait mode algorithms, the specialized software filters.
Exactly. But if you actually disassemble the phone and look at the physical sensor that is capturing the photons of light, it is almost entirely dominated by Sony CMOS chips.
Right. Sony manufactures the underlying physical hardware that actually sees the world, while the phone brands just apply software tweaks on top of that raw data.
And that dynamic maps perfectly onto Anthropic and Google. Google is providing the CMOS, they provide the massive Ironwood TPU physical silicon clusters and the underlying infrastructure.
And Anthropic is merely adding the ISP filter.
Yeah.
Their safety alignment, their constitutional AI framework, their fine-tuning, all of that is just a filter applied over the raw physical processing power dictated and owned by Google.
The raw calculation, the fundamental ingestion of the data, is entirely a Google product.
It is. The whole illusion of algorithmic freedom starts to crack when you realize that the hardware host defines the mathematical boundaries.
But I want to push back on this constraint for a second, because Anthropic publishes genuinely groundbreaking research.
They do, yeah.
They are pioneers in mechanics like sparse autoencoders, genuinely peering into the black box of neural networks and mapping how concepts are represented internally. Surely that level of unique software brilliance allows them to outcode or bypass the physical limitations of the hardware? I mean, they are some of the best in the world.
You would think so, but the limiting factor isn't just the physical silicon itself. It's the translation layer. It's Google's proprietary XLA compiler.
Ah, the compiler.
And compiler is the actual gatekeeper here. Anthropic might write brilliant, high-level, human-readable code in Python or some specialized framework.
Sure.
But the TPU silicon only understands specific electrical pulses. The XLA compiler, the Accelerated Linear Algebra compiler, is the software that translates Anthropic's high-level mathematical concepts into the physical high-level optimizer instructions that the TPU actually executes.
So because Anthropic's forward and backward passes, the literal learning and inference mechanisms of Claude have to be compiled by Google's XLA to run on the TPU, their innovation is trapped.
Trapped by translation. The compiler lowers the high-level graph representation into a format the hardware understands. If Google's compiler does not support a specific, novel mathematical operation, Anthropic simply cannot execute it.
So they are completely locked inside the mathematical tensor space defined by Google.
Yes.
Google writes the rules of translation. If Anthropic invents a new word, but Google's dictionary refuses to translate it, that word can never be spoken by the hardware.
That is exactly right. There is no true algorithmic freedom under those conditions. Anthropic can only innovate within the precise, rigid boundaries that Google's hardware and compiler allow.
So this narrative of the independent startup taking on the legacy giant, it ignores the fact that the startup operates entirely within a walled garden.
A walled garden built, maintained, and physically controlled by the giant.
Okay, so if we accept that Google's compiler translates all of Anthropic's code and their algorithms are physically bound to Google's TPUs, that fundamentally shatters the biggest promise these AI startups make to their enterprise client.
Which is data privacy.
Exactly. This brings us to the fallacy of confidential computing and the physical flow asymmetry between the tenant and the landlord.
Right, because the public relations defense from cloud providers always leans super heavily on encryption. They market AES 256 encryption, hardware roots of trust, and secure enclaves as these impenetrable fortresses. They promise that even though Google owns the servers, they have zero visibility into Anthropic's proprietary model weights or the sensitive data being processed.
And in a sterile, theoretical, mathematical environment, that encryption is unbreakable.
Sure, theoretically.
But we aren't talking about abstract math. We are talking about physical data centers. Cryptography becomes a sociological and physical vulnerability when the entity hosting your servers is also your biggest competitor.
And crucially, the author of the compiler translating your data.
Right. So how do the sources dismantle this security theater? Because they go into detail on side channel attacks, right?
Oh, heavily. They detail the physical mechanics of surveillance. The physical landlord doesn't need to break a single encryption key to see exactly what the tenant is doing.
How does that actually work?
Let's look at the actual electricity flowing into those TPUs.
Yeah.
It's called differential power analysis, or DPA.
TPO, okay.
If you have a superpod of over 9,000 TPUs processing a really complex logic prompt for Claude, they draw massive amounts of electrical current.
Right, gigawatts of power.
Exactly. And when an AI model utilizes specific activation patterns, especially the sparse activation patterns Anthropic specializes in, where only a highly specific subset of neurons fires for a given concept, it creates a distinct microsecond-level fluctuation in the electrical power being drawn from the infrastructure.
Wait, so you are saying Google doesn't even need to decrypt the software?
Not at all.
They can theoretically just look at the literal power cables, measure the microscopic hum of the electricity at the microsecond level, and reverse engineer the shape of the thought process.
Yes. By monitoring the power traces of thousands of TPUs, an entity with Google's absolute physical access can reverse engineer Claude's weight distributions and activation patterns.
That is wild. The physical electricity betrays the shape of the software.
It paints a perfect silhouette of the algorithm. The encrypted data is irrelevant when the physical energy required to process that data shows you exactly what it's doing.
And it goes beyond just power consumption, doesn't it? Let's talk about those compiler hooks we discussed earlier.
Right, because Anthropic has to use Google's XLA compiler, Google has total visibility into the translation process itself, way before the data even hits the main encrypted bus.
So they see it in plain text, essentially.
Basically, Google can legally, and under the standard operational guise of, like, system optimization or telemetry, insert optimization graphs during the compile phase.
Telemetry is always the excuse.
Always. And these graphs can expose key tensor features and intermediate data shapes to peripheral memory layers. They can capture the essence of the architecture before the encryption lock ever clicks shut.
They grab the blueprint while it's still on the drafting table.
Exactly.
And even if we assume the data is perfectly encrypted in transit, you still have the vulnerability of memory access patterns, right?
Yeah, that's another massive hole in the armor.
The encryption hides the contents of the data blocks, sure, but it cannot hide the frequency, the volume, or the physical trajectory of those blocks moving around the hardware.
Because in these high-performance systems, data is moving frantically between high-bandwidth memory and the hyperfast RAM located physically adjacent to the processor cores.
Right.
A sophisticated observer monitoring the physical pathways can watch where the encrypted blocks are moving and exactly how often they move.
They can see the traffic patterns even if the cars have tinted windows.
That's a great way to put it. By analyzing the trajectory of the data flow, they can deduce the architectural structure of the model running the tasks.
It's like sitting at a high-stakes poker table where you've brought your own opaque, perfectly secure deck of cards. The encryption is flawless.
Sure. But the casino owner built the table.
Right.
They installed microscopic weight sensors in your chair to track when you lean forward. They have thermal cameras analyzing your heart rate and pupil dilation when you draw a card. They own the shoe that shuffles the deck.
They don't need to see the ink on the front of your cards to know your exact hand.
They know you have a full house purely from your biological and physical footprint in the environment they built.
The casino owner is the physical host, and the tenant is playing a completely rigged game.
And the economic mechanism design of this relationship makes the exploitation of these vulnerabilities practically inevitable.
Explain that. Why is it inevitable?
We are analyzing a market where the potential profit of perfectly replicating a competitor's architecture is measured in hundreds of billions, potentially trillions of dollars.
It's winner-takes-all economics on a planetary scale.
Exactly. Combine that astronomical financial incentive with the fact that the probability of the physical host being caught executing a side-channel attack on their own proprietary hardware is statistically near zero.
Because who's going to audit them?
Right. There is no independent auditor on Earth with the jurisdiction or the technical capability to walk into a hyperscale Google data center and detect a microvoltage power analysis attack, or to analyze proprietary compiler optimization hooks.
The risk of getting caught is zero, and the financial reward is infinite.
So under those economic conditions, the encryption is just a polite fiction. It's a marketing tool that allows corporate clients to sleep at night, while the physical landlord holds absolute asymmetric power over the data.
Okay, so if we accept this premise that Google possesses overarching physical control, architectural constraints, and side channel visibility over Anthropic, we have to look at the real-world timeline to see if this orchestration plays out in public.
Oh, it absolutely does.
Which brings us to the 7-day smoking gun from March 2023. This is where the theoretical physics translates into observable market manipulation.
Yeah, early 2023 was the ignition point of the AI wars. ChatGPT had launched, the enterprise market was panicking, and the pressure on Google and the startups was just immense.
So Anthropic officially launched their flagship model, Claude, to the public on March 14th, 2023.
And exactly 7 days later, on March 21st, 2023, Google officially launched Bard, the predecessor to the Gemini models.
7 days apart.
The illusion of coincidence here is just staggering when you understand the physics of massive compute scheduling.
Right, because launching a foundation model to the global public, opening up an API to thousands of developers and enterprise clients, that requires an astronomical, localized allocation of physical compute power.
You are suddenly exposing your infrastructure to millions of unpredictable concurrent requests. You don't just flip a switch. You need vast data centers primed and dedicated to handling an unprecedented spike in traffic.
So if Anthropic and Google were truly independent, fierce competitors, they would both be fighting for the exact same underlying TPU physical capacity at the exact same time to support their respective global launches.
Which would be a disaster. A synchronized, uncoordinated launch of two massive foundation models on the same hardware cluster within a 7-day window would cause catastrophic network congestion.
Anthropic would be demanding maximum compute capacity from Google Cloud on March 14th, while Google internally would be demanding maximum capacity for their own launch that exact same week.
The power allocation failures and latency spikes would ruin the user experience for both of them. It simply doesn't work.
It doesn't work unless it is meticulously orchestrated by a single command center.
Exactly. If we look at standard cloud infrastructure practices, this timeline screams of a blue-green deployment, but executed on a macroeconomic scale.
Let's break down blue-green deployments for the listener. In traditional software engineering, a blue-green deployment is a risk mitigation strategy, right?
Yeah. You have two identical hardware environments. You route a small amount of traffic to the new environment, the blue one, to see if it breaks.
And if it's stable, you slowly transition the rest of the traffic over. You test the pipeline with a vanguard.
Right.
So are you telling me Google used a supposedly independent competitor as the vanguard to stress test their own plumbing?
The timeline supports exactly that. Look at March 14th. Google provisions the capacity for Anthropic to launch Claude. Claude acts as Plan A, the vanguard. Google uses the massive, real-world influx of traffic hitting Claude to test their TPU cluster's absolute limits under brutal, unpredictable BDB stress.
They are validating the stability of their liquid cooling, their network routing, and their physical silicon using Anthropic's user base.
But, the physical stress test is actually secondary to the psychological and public relations stress test.
What do you mean?
Well, early 2023 was incredibly volatile. AI models were hallucinating, generating offensive content, and facing massive media backlash. By allowing Anthropic to launch first, Google effectively offloads all the legal, PR, and ethical risks onto a third-party startup.
Oh, wow. If Claude goes rogue, generates a massive copyright violation, or says something horrific, the media attacks Anthropic.
Exactly. Google's core search brand remains completely insulated. Google gets to watch the minefield get cleared by someone else.
That is incredibly Machiavellian. So 7 days pass, March 21.
The physical infrastructure has proven highly stable under global load. The cache data is primed, the public appetite and the media reaction are verified. The minefield is clear.
And only then does Google allocate the remaining optimized compute capacity to launch Bard. Bard is Plan B.
Right.
But wait, why bother with Plan B if Plan A is successfully capturing the enterprise market?
Because Google must protect its core consumer search monopoly. They cannot allow Anthropic to gain dominant brand recognition in the consumer space, and they needed to demonstrate to Wall Street that their internal teams had a direct answer to OpenAI.
So they deploy the second track of the capital hedge.
Yeah, this is the Procter & Gamble analogy from the sources, but applied to a trillion-dollar technology market.
I love this analogy. Break it down for us.
Well, Procter & Gamble owns both Head & Shoulders and Pantene. They position them right next to each other on the supermarket shelf, with completely different marketing campaigns, different bottle shapes, different target demographics.
Right. One is for dandruff, one is for volume and shine.
Exactly. The consumer walks down the aisle, compares the ingredients, weighs the benefits, and feels a sense of agency. They believe they're making a free, independent choice in a competitive market.
I buy Head and Shoulders for functionality. You buy Pantene for the aesthetic. We fiercely defend our preferences, completely ignoring that the money we spend flows back to the exact same parent company.
And Google orchestrated the exact same illusion of choice on a massive scale. The enterprise customer, terrified of PR disasters, chooses Claude for its heavily marketed safety and alignment.
Right.
The consumer or the integrated workspace user chooses Bard or Gemini for its ecosystem integration. They feel they are participating in a diverse marketplace.
The gigawatts of electricity, the rent for the silicon, the compiler taxes, all of the capital flows directly back to Google.
Google wins the infrastructure revenue, regardless of which software filter the client prefers. It is a perfect dual-track capital hedge.
This paradigm shift inevitably leads us to the mathematical future of these models. If Claude and Gemini are running on the exact same physical hardware, forced through the same compiler translation, and orchestrated by the same command center, will they eventually become the exact same AI?
The math of convergent evolution suggests they absolutely will. The sources describe this phenomenon as the constrained convergence of high-dimensional manifolds.
That sounds intense. How do we visualize that?
To understand this, we have to visualize the architecture of a foundation model as a high-dimensional mathematical manifold, a vast, complex topological space containing hundreds of billions of parameters.
Okay, so a giant multidimensional shape.
Right. And the process of training the AI is essentially molding this massive mathematical structure to optimally predict human language and logic.
If two independent teams are molding clay in separate rooms with different tools trying to build different sculptures, you naturally get divergent results.
But Claude and Gemini are not being sculpted independently. They're being compressed by identical, unyielding constraints.
What's the first constraint?
The first constraint is the raw material, the data. Both models are scraping and ingesting the exact same high-quality internet corpus.
Wikipedia, GitHub, Reddit, digitized academic libraries.
Exactly. The foundational knowledge base is completely identical.
And the second constraint is the physical law we discussed earlier,
Yeah.
the TPU systolic array.
Yes. They're both forced to optimize their mathematical branching to run efficiently on the exact same rigid hardware pipeline to avoid those catastrophic financial bubbles.
Right. And the third constraint?
The third constraint is the behavioral alignment, RLHF, or reinforcement learning from human feedback.
Right, teaching the model how to behave.
Both models are being aggressively trained by corporate entities to be polite, helpful, harmless, and legally insulated. The desired behavioral output is identical.
So if you force the exact same raw data through the exact same physical hardware constraints, aiming for the exact same corporate-friendly behavioral outcome, the mathematics dictate that those high-dimensional manifolds will compress into the same shape.
It is a statistical inevitability.
Yeah.
The analogy of aerodynamics perfectly illustrates this constraint.
The wind tunnel analogy, right? Let's talk about that.
Think about a century ago. Automobile designs were wildly divergent. You had boxy shapes, elongated curves, and massive grills because they were optimizing for different stylistic goals at relatively low speeds.
But look at the modern electric vehicle market today. A Tesla Model 3, a Porsche Taycan, a Hyundai Ioniq 6.
If you strip the branding off, their silhouettes are incredibly similar.
They really are. They all share that exact same teardrop shape, flush door handles, sloping aerodynamic rooflines.
Right, and they haven't converged because of corporate espionage. They have converged because of the unyielding laws of physics inside a wind tunnel.
Because if the overarching goal is to maximize battery range, you have to minimize aerodynamic drag.
The wind tunnel aggressively punishes any design choice that deviates from the optimal aerodynamic form.
So in the AI industry, the high-quality internet data and the rigid Google TPU clusters are the wind tunnel.
They represent the unyielding physical and mathematical reality. Anthropic might want Claude to have a deeply unique, idiosyncratic personality or reasoning structure, but the wind tunnel will eventually force it into the exact same optimal shape as Gemini.
Because any deviation from that shape results in massive compute inefficiencies or alignment failures.
Exactly. But the convergence isn't just passive. It is actively accelerated by what the sources call the directional gravity of asymmetric information.
Directional gravity. Okay. Building on the side channel surveillance we discussed, this means Google doesn't just passively put Gemini in the wind tunnel and hope it finds the optimal shape, right?
Right. Because Google possesses physical oversight over Anthropic's compute. They can monitor exactly how Claude successfully navigates the wind tunnel.
So they can capture the specific physical trace of a successful algorithm and apply a directional gravity field to Gemini's loss function.
Exactly that.
Let's unpack the mechanism of that directional gravity. For the listener, in AI training, a loss function is basically the mathematical metric of how wrong the model is, right?
Yeah, and the entire training process is gradient descent, trying to find the lowest possible point of loss, the optimal solution.
So imagine Claude is performing exceptionally well on a highly complex task, perhaps advanced legal reasoning or some multi-step logic puzzle.
Because Google is the physical landlord, they can monitor the microfluctuations in power and the specific tensor pathways executing on their chips as Claude successfully navigates that puzzle.
They observe the winning mathematical formula physically executing in real time.
Yes. They don't need to steal Anthropic source code. They just watch the physics of the successful thought.
That is mind-blowing.
And with that physical insight, Google can subtly adjust the training parameters for Gemini. They can condition Gemini's probability path.
They essentially tilt the mathematical floor of the loss function.
Exactly, creating a gravitational pull that naturally guides Gemini's gradient descent toward the exact same mathematical solution that Claude discovered.
It is the equivalent of taking an unimaginably difficult test, where the teacher is also taking the test, but the teacher has thermal cameras monitoring your eye movements, your scratch paper, and your heart rate while you solve the hardest equation.
Yes.
They use your biological and physical struggle to perfectly construct their own answer key without ever officially looking at your final test paper.
The directional gravity of that asymmetric information practically guarantees homogenization. Anthropic essentially functions as a highly subsidized external R&D department mapping the optimal paths through the tensor space.
While Google captures those paths to refine their own foundational model.
Right.
Which brings us to the ultimate existential question for the business of AI. If the physics, the hardware, the compiler, and the eventual mathematical shape of the models are all effectively controlled by Google, where is Anthropic's value?
That's the billion-dollar question.
What exactly is a company like Anthropic selling to justify a multi-billion-dollar valuation?
We really have to strip away the idealism of constitutional AI here. The sources suggest that what Anthropic is actually executing is a highly lucrative, brilliantly constructed B2B psychological grift.
A psychological grift.
Yeah.
The risk aversion premium.
Yes. We have to analyze the psychology of their primary target audience, Fortune 500 CEOs and enterprise boards.
These are executives whose entire professional existence revolves around risk management and liability mitigation.
And they're terrified of the operational integration of generative AI.
Oh, totally. They envision scenarios where a rogue chatbot hallucinates racist text, generates massive copyright infringement, or provides disastrously incorrect legal advice to a client.
Which would result in catastrophic PR damage and plummeting stock prices.
Anthropic understands that corporate anxiety perfectly. So they take the exact same underlying TPU matrix math, the same foundational data corpus, and they wrap it in a masterful psychological narrative.
They brand themselves as the adults in the room. Our AI is constitutional. It is ained. It is intrinsically safe.
So they are not selling a fundamentally superior statistical predictor. They are selling a political correctness insurance policy at a massive premium.
Exactly. The enterprise client is paying for the psychological comfort of the Anthropic brand shield.
Because if something does go wrong with the deployment, the CEO can turn to their board of directors and say, hey, we licensed the safest, most ethically aligned constitutional AI on the market. We did our due diligence.
They are buying a corporate shield, a CYA policy for the era of generative AI.
And the De Beers diamond cartel is the perfect analogy for this dynamic, isn't it?
It really is. Think about diamonds. In terms of raw physical utility and abundance, a diamond is merely compressed carbon.
Right.
But De Beers engineered one of the greatest marketing campaigns in human history to convince the global public that this specific arrangement of carbon is the ultimate, indispensable symbol of eternal love, status, and commitment.
So Anthropic is operating as the high-end jewelry boutique.
Yes. They have successfully convinced the enterprise market that their specific arrangement of parameters, their compressed carbon, is synonymous with safety, reliability, and corporate responsibility.
They extract a massive premium for the narrative attached to the math.
But if Anthropic is the high-end boutique selling the narrative of romance and safety, Google is the De Beers mining cartel.
Google does not need to get its hands dirty managing the boutiques, crafting the marketing slogans, or dealing with corporate panic attacks over chatbot hallucinations.
Google simply owns the diamond mines. They control the gigawatts of electricity. They own the Ironwood TPU clusters.
Every single time Anthropic sells a safe enterprise contract, they must immediately turn around and hand a massive percentage of that revenue back to Google to pay for the physical compute.
Because Google has intentionally transitioned into the Sony CMOS landlord role. People often mistake Google's slower release cadence for bureaucratic incompetence.
Or a sign that they are losing the AI race.
Right. But the reality is far more strategic. If Google aggressively pushed new Gemini models and decimated the startup ecosystem, they would immediately cannibalize their own core search business.
Right, because search ads are a phenomenal goldmine with incredible profit margins. Answering every search query with a hyper-expensive, compute-heavy generative AI process destroys those margins.
So Google holds back. They let the startups fight a vicious, highly publicized war for venture capital and enterprise contracts on the front end.
It doesn't matter to Google if Anthropic, OpenAI, or Mistral wins the PR battle of the month.
Because at the end of the day, those startups are simply highly efficient capital-gathering mechanisms.
They extract billions in venture capital and enterprise revenue, only to hand it directly over to the physical infrastructure monopolies to pay the compute tax.
The startups are basically fighting over the right to pay rent to Google.
The landlord collects the tax regardless of who occupies the storefront. The physics-based cartel ensures that the house always wins.
This fundamentally changes how you process the news cycle, doesn't it?
It really does. When you see a headline announcing that Anthropic just raised another $2 billion in venture funding, the takeaway isn't that Anthropic is expanding its architectural dominance.
The takeaway is that Anthropic just secured another $2 billion to pay their Google Cloud utility bill.
That's the brutal truth. We have looked at the industry today not as some ethereal software wonderland, but as a brutal landscape governed by thermodynamics, compiler bottlenecks, and asymmetric physical power.
We've seen how the illusion of architectural freedom is crushed by the rigid reality of TPU systolic arrays and the XLA compiler trapping algorithms in a predefined tensor space.
We've seen how confidential computing becomes security theater when the physical host can leverage compiler hooks, microsecond power analysis, and memory trajectories to map the shape of the data.
And we examined the macroeconomic blue-green deployment of March 2023, where a supposedly independent competitor was used as a stress test vanguard to clear the minefield for the landlord's primary asset.
We explored the constrained convergence of high-dimensional manifolds, proving that identical hardware, data, and alignment goals accelerated by the directional gravity of physical surveillance will force these models into the exact same mathematical shape.
And we exposed the B2B psychological grift, where startups sell risk-aversion premiums to terrify executives while acting as capital funnels for the De Beers-style hardware cartels.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply unsettling thought regarding the financial velocity of this entire ecosystem.
Right.
Right now, the front-end boutiques are using brilliant constitutional marketing to extract billions of dollars in VC funding, immediately transferring that wealth to the physical landlords to keep the liquid cooling pumps running.
But what happens when the psychological marketing loses its efficacy?
Exactly. What happens when Fortune 500 boards realize they are paying a massive premium for a mathematical illusion? When the hype cycle inevitably cools and the venture capital dries up, the physical landlord will still demand that their gigawatts of electricity and their silicon depreciation be paid for.
The bills don't stop.
When the clean white box of the chat interface stops looking like magic and reveals itself to be an unimaginably expensive, power-hungry industrial utility who survives the day the physics bill comes due.
That's the real question.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you read a tech press release about a revolutionary new AI model, ignore the ethereal promises, look past the marketing, and follow the physical flow of the data. We'll catch you next time.